Rheumatic heart disease remains a major issue for particularly Indigenous populations here in Australia, and in particular in Central and Northern Australia. And many years ago, the recognition of this led to us looking around the world as to how other places are dealing with rheumatic fever and rheumatic heart disease. So in the 1990s, our Northern Territory Centre for Disease Control, which is part of the NT Department of Health, put together the first ever rheumatic fever, rheumatic heart disease program for Australia, and that was for the Northern Territory population, specifically really the Indigenous population, and most orientated towards people living in rural and remote communities where the rates are so high. And so that program was very much adapted from the guidelines that had been developed by WHO, and really it was like a recipe of what's the evidence as to how you can go about trying to prevent the severe end consequences of rheumatic heart disease. The Commonwealth Government recognised the issue of rheumatic fever, rheumatic heart disease across remote Indigenous communities in Australia. There needed to be some form of centralised coordinating unit. So that was the origins of Rheumatic Heart Disease Australia, which was the national coordinating unit for the Australian Commonwealth Government's rheumatic fever, rheumatic heart disease strategy. And a lot of that advocacy for the Commonwealth to provide this funding came from our former director here at Menzies School of Health Research, Professor Jonathan Karapetis, and he indeed was the director of the initial Rheumatic Heart Disease Australia. Jonathan subsequently left to become director of Telethon Kids Institute in Perth and maintains his leadership in Australia of a lot of the initiatives on rheumatic fever, rheumatic heart disease, and in particular looking towards what's called the end game, which is funding which is helping a roadmap be created to give to the Commonwealth as to how things can be progressed ahead to decrease rheumatic fever, rheumatic heart disease to levels which are the same in the Indigenous population as in the rest of the Australian population, which is basically zero, and that's the ultimate aim. No child will die from rheumatic fever or acute rheumatic fever or its consequences is the target for us at Rheumatic Heart Disease Australia. In the last year, we've expanded in a really important way, and to me the most exciting thing that's happened in recent years in this whole area is the expansion to include support for people living with rheumatic fever, rheumatic heart disease and their families. And this is the Champions for Change program that Vicky Wade has been our strong cultural lead on, also Deanna Mosca, who's our clinical nurse specialist. You know, they're all working together to bring together the Champions for Change program, which is identifying people who would like themselves as people either living with or family members of people with rheumatic fever, rheumatic heart disease, who they would like to really have their own voices and speak to people, other people potentially in communities, but also the general Australian population. We hope to be able to continue to work in all of those areas as really our commitment to achieving our aim, which again I think is just a very simple aim, and that is no child in Australia, and particularly no Indigenous kid, will die in the future from rheumatic fever, rheumatic heart disease or its consequences.